The lights in the guard tower blinked like small stars over a sea of concrete. Men in uniforms watched the yard below. Then, in one quick moment, everything changed. A guard in the hall was helping a prisoner take a shower. The prisoner used a trick. Another man passed him a homemade knife. The guard was hurt, and then he died. The news moved fast to the prison and then out to the world. A corrections officer had been killed inside the federal prison at Marion. People who worked in prisons felt shocked and very sad. The man who had done it was Thomas Silverstein, and this moment is the one everyone remembers first because it showed how dangerous things had become inside the prison. That is the loud, highest part of the story. The part that makes people stop and ask, how did this happen? For a while after that day, guards refused to have any normal contact with Thomas Silverstein. They would not talk to him or touch him. He became one of the most feared prisoners in the United States. The way the prison reacted to him helped change how federal prisons handled the most dangerous people. Now, let's go back to the beginning, so we can see how a quiet little boy grew into a man who lived inside prison for most of his life. Thomas Edward Silverstein was born in Long Beach, California, in 1952. When he was young, he did not have an easy life. He said his childhood had hard times and small houses. He got into trouble as a youth, and later in life, he was arrested for robbery. At first, his crimes were not about hurting people to be mean. They were crimes like robbery. For that, he was sent to prison. Prison was where he began to change. He met people there, and some of those people were part of groups that used violence to get what they wanted. In time, Silverstein joined one of those groups, a gang called the Aryan Brotherhood. That gang used violence and made strict rules for its members. His ties to the gang pulled him deeper into hard choices and dangerous fights. Inside prison, life is different from life outside. Outside, you have friends and family and a town. Inside, you live in a building with many other men. Some people were friendly, but others looked for power. When a prisoner joins a gang, they trade normal life for a life where fights and rules can decide what happens next. Thomas learned quickly how to survive inside the system. He got into fights, and he did things that got him more time in prison. These steps were small at first, but they made his life inside prison harsher and harsher. He was first sent to a high-security prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. There he met other men who were dangerous and who had long prison sentences. He learned how to make a name for himself. He also learned how to use tools and how to plan. Over time, he was accused of being involved in killings of other inmates. Some of those charges stuck, and some were later changed in court. But by the early 1980s, he had already been blamed for serious crimes while behind bars. This meant he could not go back to a normal cell block. He would stay in a special, much stricter section of prison for people the guards called the worst troublemakers. At Marion Penitentiary in Illinois, things were tense. The prison had a place called the Control Unit. Men who were very violent or who caused a lot of trouble were put there. The Control Unit was like a small island inside the larger prison. The men lived in tiny cells. The lights were on most of the time, and guards watched them closely through cameras. It was not a nice place to live. Thomas was put there because officials thought he was too dangerous to be in a normal housing unit. Wikipedia. One big reason things blew up at Marion was that two groups inside the Control Unit did not get along. One group was the Aryan Brotherhood, which Thomas was linked to. The other group was tied to black prison gangs. The two sides hated each other, and they wanted to control the small space where they lived. Prison records show that fights and threats were common. The people who ran the prison were worried, but they did not have an easy way to keep the men apart at all times. On some days, that danger turned into deadly actions. The day the guard died started like other days, but ended in a way no one wanted. Thomas and another prisoner used a plan to get out of their cells for a short time. A homemade knife was passed to Thomas. He used it, and the guard was killed. Another guard later died in a related attack. After these events, the government saw that the Control Unit had failed to stop the violence. Something had to change to keep guards and prisoners safe. The murders led to tighter rules in federal prisons and helped push the idea for a new kind of prison with far stricter control, a place that would be able to hold the most dangerous inmates with as little chance to hurt others as possible. That new design later became ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado. Many people point to the Marion murders as a turning point in how federal prisons operate. After the guard's death, the Bureau of Prisons made a decision about Thomas Silverstein that was very harsh. He was moved from the regular prison cells and kept in almost total isolation. The rule for him was often written as no human contact. That meant he was kept alone in a small cell for most of the day. He had lights on most of the time, and he ate his meals through a small slot in the door. He could not join programs or speak freely with other inmates. He had very few phone calls and very little chance to go outside. Guards had orders to keep distance and to avoid normal conversation with him because other officers refused to be near him out of respect for the guard who had been killed. This kind of treatment went on for decades. Many people later asked if it was fair and if it was cruel. Some prison leaders said they had no other safe option. Inside his small cell, Thomas thought and wrote. He said later that he had been pushed into those acts because of how prison treated him, and that the cruel life inside a cell made things worse. Other former inmates and some writers said the guards sometimes used harsh methods that made the situation worse. People who study prison say that long isolation can change how a person feels and behaves, and that the system must be careful to protect both staff and prisoners. The story of Thomas put these questions in the spotlight. Is total isolation safer for the public? Is it too cruel? Those questions followed his whole life in prison. Even while he was isolated, Thomas's name made him into a kind of legend inside the prison world. Some people feared him. Some were curious, and others thought he was being treated too harshly. He stayed locked up for a very long time. He was moved later to the Supermax prison ADX Florence, where the strict rules were the same or even stronger than they were at Marion. He spent decades living in the same kind of lonely conditions, and he became one of the most isolated prisoners in federal history. He lived in a small cell, alone for 23 hours a day, with only short times for showering or exercise in a tiny space. He was rarely seen by others except through cameras and slot doors. As the years passed, the world outside the prison talked about him. Journalists wrote stories. Lawyers tried to challenge the rules that kept him isolated. The government argued it had to protect its staff and the public. Some people felt pity for Thomas and said that no human should be kept with so little contact for so many years. Others felt anger and said he had taken lives and must pay the price. These debates are complicated, and they show how hard it is to balance safety, justice, and fairness in a prison system. The most important moments of Thomas's life in prison were not always the violent ones. They were the small details that showed how different his life had become. He ate through a slot. He walked in a tiny yard alone. He had almost no visitors. He slept under a bright light, in a room meant to be watched. These details are hard to imagine for someone who lives outside. They show how the punishment and the protection mixed in prison life. Many prison experts use this story to teach new officers and lawmakers about what happens when the system locks someone away, without contact for so long. Still, the memory of the guard who died stayed strong for officers and for the families who lost someone that day. Officers said they would not work normally around Thomas because it felt like a disrespect to the man who had been killed. That feeling helped keep the rule of no human contact in place. Bureau of Prisons officials explained that when someone kills a guard, they must be punished, and because the death penalty was not an option then, keeping the person alone was the next step. People who saw things from outside sometimes argued that other solutions might have been possible, but the prison said it had to protect its staff. As Chapter 1 ends, think of the image of the little cell with a single light and a man sitting inside. Think of the day the guard was killed, and how that one moment echoed into decades of policy changes and tough choices. The prison system changed how it worked after that day, and Thomas Silverstein's life became a symbol. To some a warning about the worst dangers in prison, and to others a sign of how harsh the system could be. We stop here. When you are ready, I will continue with Chapter 2 and tell how the courts, lawyers, and the public reacted over the years, how Silverstein's life in solitary played out, and how the long debate over solitary confinement grew louder.